And welcome to Maker's Corner. Today we're going to be making this cool little survival stove. It's a pretty easy build, only takes about 5 to 10 minutes, and you can make it out of household items. So first we're going to need 2 soda cans, or in my case Rockstar cans. We're also going to need something to cut it with. I have an old X-acto knife here. And we're also going to need a push pin or thumbtack. And then last but not least, we're going to need a penny to act as a pressure release valve. Some optional items that you could also use to make this job easier are a pair of wire cutters or scissors, needle nose pliers, and a hammer. You don't necessarily need these items, but they will make things quite a bit easier for you later on in this build. So right here I'm going to start off by scoring the can. I found this old router that I had lying around that was just over an inch tall, so I used that as a guide. Originally I was going to keep slicing through the can until I sliced through enough of it that it just kind of fell apart on its own and cut in half, but my blade was a little dull, so I just decided to score the can just enough that I could use the score line as a cutting guide. Go ahead and take your time here, because X-acto knives aren't really known for being, well, forgiving if you have a bit of a slip of the hand, so take your time, be safe, and don't do anything stupid. So there's our bottom half. Next we're going to move on to our top half of the can here. Now, I'm using the same guide here to make the score line, but we're not actually going to cut on that score line. We're actually going to go about a ½ inch lower, because the top half of the can does need to be a bit smaller than the bottom half, and you'll see why later on in the video. So I'm just cutting this one freehand using that top score line as a guide, so that I kind of have an idea of where I need to cut. Alright, so now that we've got our 2 halves cut out, we need to start preparing the bottom half. The bottom half is going to be the larger one. Now you could do this by hand, but because I have some needle nose pliers around, I'm going to use those instead. What we want to do is basically just crimp the can a little bit in on itself. This will make it a lot easier when we go to slide the 2 halves together. Again, if you don't have a pair of needle nose pliers, you could probably find something else that would help you do this, or you could even do it by hand if you're really careful. But I wouldn't recommend it, as those edges are very sharp. So if you do it by hand, please be very careful. So now we're done crimping it, I'm just going to take my wire cutters, or you could even use a pair of scissors for this, and I'm just going to make a couple of small little slits around the top edge here, just to make it a little bit easier for the bottom half to kind of collapse in on itself when we go to put the 2 halves together. The last bit of prep for the cans here, I'm just going to use my needle nose pliers to straighten out the edge of the can, because as we cut the cans in half, they do tend to bend inwards, so we just want to use our needle nose pliers, or again, like I said, if you have to, you could use your fingers. Just be very careful of that sharp edge. So we want it to be nice and flat, and maybe even flare it out just a little bit. It'll make it a lot easier. So now we're going to put the 2 halves together. They should slide together very easily with little to no force. It may look like I'm using a lot of force here, but I'm really just trying to be careful that I don't split the cans while I'm putting them together. Alright, now that our 2 halves have been joined together, we need to move on to our push pin. First, start off with puncturing a hole directly in the center of the top of the can. You're going to want this hole to be a little bit wider than the rest of them, so spend a little time using the thumbtack to widen that hole a bit. After you're done with that, you're going to want to puncture 4 more holes, smaller ones, directly around that center hole. When you're finished, it should look something like that. Next up, we're going to want to puncture 16 more holes around the outside edge of the can. Now this is where having a small hammer, or even the butt end of a screwdriver to use to tap the thumbtack into the sidewall can really help. Again, it's not necessary, you can do it without it, but it does make it a lot easier. So while I'm working here, I just want to explain how this whole stove works. So we're going to end up filling it up with some rubbing alcohol. The penny on top is going to act as a pressure release valve. Basically, this entire thing runs off of pressure. The penny is there in case the pressure builds up a little too much. That penny can pop up ever so slightly and release some pressure so the can doesn't explode. And we're finished. So if you did everything correctly, this is what it should look like. So grab your penny and grab your rubbing alcohol and let's light this puppy up. So I'm going to be doing this test in the sink. You really should be doing this outside, away from anything flammable, preferably on a concrete surface. Because it's a little bright out today, you wouldn't really be able to see the flames too well, so I'm going to do this inside. Please don't try to copy me by doing this inside. I'm a professionally trained idiot, so leave this one to people like me. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to fill up the center of the stove. You're going to use the rubbing alcohol to kind of fill it up. You don't need too much. A little bit of fuel really goes a long way in this stove. So now I'm going to fill it up one more time, but this time I'm going to spill a little bit over the edge. This is kind of important because this is how we're going to start the stove. We're going to grab our penny, put it in there, so that way we have our little safety device in case too much pressure gets built up. And now we're going to throw some fire in there. So I'm going to speed this video up because it does take about a minute for the stove to get started, but I'm going to explain what's happening here. So that little bit of alcohol that we spilt on the side of it is heating up the can from the outside. As the can heats up, the alcohol inside the can turns into a gas. As that gas starts to rise up through the little holes, the fire on the outside begins to ignite it. Once it gets started, it's pretty difficult to put out. I was saying over an AC vent and blowing on it, and it was still pretty difficult to put out. Now I did put it out here on purpose just to show you it is possible to relight it fairly easily if it does happen to go out, but you do only have about a 10-second window to do that before the alcohol cools too much and is no longer in a gaseous form. And well, that just about does it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this quick little DIY tutorial on how to make a little survival stove. If you decide to make one of these, please be safe with it. It's really easy to underestimate the dangers that come associated with fire. So be smart, be responsible, and I will see you guys in the next video.